Lately, there's been a severe shortage in good comedy movies. Bert Kreischer's The Machine was supposed to be the revival of comedy. With marketing everywhere, a huge budget, and a star-studded cast, Sony Pictures expected it to be a massive hit. And they were severely disappointed. It lost over $10 million, was pulled from theaters after 2 weeks, and got bombed with bad reviews. Sony then panic cut a deal with Netflix to recoup their losses because the movie was doing so bad. All of this for a movie about this guy. Unfortunately for them, the biggest critique about this movie was probably the worst thing that could have been said. It is very, very boring. Literally nobody is talking about this movie. It averages about a 4 or 5 out of 10 on most outlets. Critics hate this movie. Audiences are indifferent to it. It also peaked at 8th in the box office when it came out. It's safe to say this movie was a flop. But what about the guy the story's based on? Whether as a result of this or just poor timing, Bert has received a lot more attention, although it's not the attention he wants. His problems have been brought more into the public space as a result of this movie, including his drinking problems, his beef with other comedians, and the mask of a fun party guy that he's known for slowly slipping. So that leaves us with the question, what the hell happened? The Machine, starring Bert Kreischer, is a movie that works off of his most famous story of the same name. Bert has told this story so many times that it's basically become his identity. Can anybody else name a Bert Kreischer joke? Bert's knack for being a good storyteller has led it to having over 50 million views on YouTube. The Machine, the movie, is basically a sequel to the story that totally happened, I swear you can trust this man, where Bert plays a fat, alcoholic John Wick who has to go to Russia to retrace the steps of his younger self. With such an iconic story, and more importantly, iconic views, Sony Pictures saw dollar signs, so they put an insane amount of marketing into this movie. They plastered Bert's face and belly over everything and anything. I mean, it was on the canvas at multiple UFC events for the entire thing. It felt inescapable, really. Sony also somehow got Mark Hamill to be in this movie. All for a movie centered around Bert Kreischer, who has acting credentials that are subpar to say the least. Even if Bert isn't as recognizable as somebody like Adam Sandler or David Spade, Bert and Sony thought he has a hardcore enough fan base that'll latch onto anything he does, which is 100% true. Trust me, I know. So they had Bert do a huge press tour, going on every podcast to promote the new movie, including The Fighter and the Kid.
It's like a chocolate chip with salsa all over it.
And you gotta feel for the guy. He seemed so excited. This could be his big break. And honestly, the way it looked before the movie came out with the marketing, press tour, attention, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that this movie could be a huge success. The Machine might be a blockbuster, not in the Brendan Schaub way. The marketing, the views, the laugh, it was all set up to succeed. So on May 3rd, 2023, the movie is released, and the crowd went mild. At first, The Machine had some positive reviews from the most hardcore fans who saw the early preview. However, even some of them said it was a bit much. And when even the most hardcore fans are calling your movie boring, red flags should start flying. If the hardcore audience thought this, imagine what the general audience is gonna think. Once the reviews started to come in from average movie viewers, the scores started to drop pretty hardcore. But not to the point where it's so bad that people started to see it, like Cats, for example. You see, there are good movies and there are bad movies. There are also good bad movies.
Oh, hi, Mark.
This is none of those. This is a kind of boring movie where there are minimal reviews on YouTube. The Machine landed in the worst spot a movie could possibly land. Forgettable. The general consensus seems to be it's the kind of movie you'll watch on a flight while nodding off on the 2 milligrams of Ativan you took beforehand. It released with very little competition at the time besides The Little Mermaid, and somehow still finished in 8th place after 2 weeks. Now, Sony had invested a budget that was the size of half the GDP of Tuvalu into this movie. A movie about the guy whose most famous achievement for years was being named the #1 partier at Florida State University. You'd think they want to let this thing ride a bit and see how it does, but no, they pulled the plug on it after looking at the numbers, which were abysmal. You see, Sony had done the marketing right, but they forgot basically everything else. The original Machine story is from 2016. They acquired the rights to the movie in 2018, and the movie came out in 2023. I'm sure the pandemic delays didn't help, but let's be honest, people aren't as invested in the machine as they were 6 years ago.
Boring.
But even if it did come out 6 years ago, it's not a retelling of the story or a dramatization of it, it's a completely new story that takes place after the original one that's not nearly as compelling. This video is sponsored by Factor. If you're a busy guy like me, sometimes you don't have time to cook. Factor helps people like me by delivering fresh, never frozen meals to your doorstep that you can prep and eat in just 2 minutes. All you have to do is heat and enjoy. Then you can get back to doing whatever it is you're doing. It's bulking season this autumn, so Factor has you covered for that. Try Protein Plus meals with 30 grams of protein or more per serving. Factor legit saves me so much time because it's so quick and easy. Even a moron like myself can make these and not screw them up. I got the Chef's Choice meals, which included this one right here, which was easily my favorite one I've tried. So head to factor75.com or go to the link in the description and use code GHOSTGUM50 to get a whopping 50% off your first Factor box. That's factor75.com with code GHOSTGUM50 to get 50% off your first box. After a week, Sony realized this was going to be a huge flop, commercially and critically, and they were right. So after another week in the box office, they decided to recoup their losses, pulling it from theaters and cutting a deal with Netflix, pretending like this movie never even existed. Keep in mind, the budget for this movie was $20 million, which does not include the insane marketing campaign. It only made back $10.7 million, so they easily lost over $10 million. Likely a lot more than that, however, we'll never truly know. But Bert had been promoting this movie like it was his big break. And if you know anything about Bert, he has the ego of a man who plasters his face over his tour bus. So you can imagine this didn't sit well with him. Because no matter which way you look at this movie, it's a flop. Even if it was poorly received but made a shit ton of money, I think it would have satisfied old Bert. But it wasn't that. It was a critical and commercial failure. It was marketed so hard for his fan base, a fan base that Bert and Sony wildly overestimated the size of. Bert made some surprise appearances at movie theaters for showings of this movie, where the crowd turnout was allegedly in single digits for one of those showings, which might be the most depressingly hilarious thing I've ever heard. It was also probably assumed that Joe Rogan's audience would eat this up, but what they didn't realize is a lot of them have turned on Bert recently. Not only on the Joe Rogan subreddit, but the Bert Kreischer subreddit seems to hate him. And if that's indicative of his general fan base, it seems the tides are turning, and that's not a good thing for Bert. But the thing is, you can't blame people for this. From his obnoxious podcast appearances, his try-hard personality, his nails on a chalkboard laugh, and his elitism that would make you think being a comedian is like being a firefighter.
A comic's brain is so different than a pedestrian's brain. And like what, you know, like I can't help. I went
Pedestrian is so funny, by the way.
Oh.
Like saying that.
I said to a woman, yeah.
That drives me crazy. It's like, we're not in the fucking armed force. Let's fucking relax.
It's kind of easy to see why people dislike Bert. But worst of all, Bert's funny, laid-back party guy facade has been starting to give a bit. I mean, he's an old man now with kids. There's only so long you could be a drunk idiot.
How do you do, fellow kids?
Ari Shaffir told a story about how Bert Kreischer had a meltdown because of food? And not his own food that somebody else was ordering. But weirdly enough, it seems Ari is one of the only real friends that Bert has. Everyone around him seems to be just an enabler. The man is looking worse and worse in terms of his alcoholism. I mean, look at how bloated he is. That's not from food, I'll tell you that. And it's clear he has no intention of stopping drinking. He can't even admit he has a problem. Consistently having 12 drinks is not normal. But what's weird about this is he used to be universally loved. He was that chubby, feel-good guy who would tell crazy stories. But what worked in 2016 doesn't necessarily work now. The machine might have even worked in 2018 or 2019, but the story's been told hundreds of times now. After a certain point, people probably just stopped caring. Men lie, women lie, but the numbers don't. However, I should say, even though this movie flopped, Bert still sells out arenas, rides on private jets, and does very well with his podcasts. Financially, he's fine. At the end of the day, it really only hurt his ego. But that's the thing with Bert. It's all ego with him. He needs to be liked at all times by everybody, which is impossible. It's the Charlie Brown conundrum. He puts on this fake persona to sell himself as somebody that he's not, which leads to way more scrutiny about who he actually is. On top of that, I don't care what you say, his laugh is one of the worst things I've heard in my entire life.